Your Eminences, Hierarchs of the Ecumenical Throne, Reverend Fathers, fellow members of the Order of Deacons, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It is truly an honor for me to be with you here this afternoon and to be amongst so many friends, old and new, that I've made over the last year and a half in my position as Ambassador for Religious Freedom. I want to say from the outset that the Ecumenical Patriarchate is an important actor from the perspective of defending religious freedom in the world, and this is something that the Government of Canada recognizes. Greek Orthodox and other Eastern Orthodox Christians in communion with the Patriarchal Throne of Constantinople form a vital component of Canada's multicultural and multi-faith identity. They have made and continue to make substantial contributions to Canadian society, especially here in Toronto. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And I would like to thank especially His Eminence Metropolitan Sotirios for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to all of you. The theme for my comments to you today will be three interrelated fundamental principles that link to this question of religious freedom. These principles are truth, dignity, and justice. These principles are underscored in one of the documents I consider as foundational to the understanding of religious freedom, and that is Dignitatis Humanae from the Second Vatican Council. And as a good Catholic, I like to say that I keep it in my back pocket wherever I go. As this document states, and I'm quoting, "Religious freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits." And it continues, "It is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all men should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth." It continues, "Truth, however, is to be sought after in a manner proper to the dignity of the human person and his social nature. The inquiry is to be free, carried on with the aid of teaching or instruction, communication, and dialogue, in the course of which men explain to one another the truth they have discovered or think they have discovered, in order thus to assist one another in the quest for truth." So as you can see, truth and dignity are at the center of this document, and I want to again elaborate on those. I think the fundamental principles of truth, dignity, and justice relate directly to the mandate of the Office of Religious Freedom. So I would ask you to bear with me if I could take you through a bit of an overview of the mandate that we have. Some of you might not be familiar with it, and also to explain some of our activities. I will also touch on the issue of religious freedom in Turkey, an important country, of course, for the Ecumenical Patriarchate, as we have just seen in the video, but also important in a more general sense from the perspective of religious freedom. From there, I would like to lead into a brief discussion of the unique role I see for the Ecumenical Patriarchate in advancing religious freedom globally. And finally, I want to touch on religious freedom more broadly in the region, the Middle East and Near East, to explain how it relates to the conflict in Iraq and Syria, and how religious freedom, especially as advanced by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, can contribute to long-term peace and stability. So first, to speak on the Office of Religious Freedom. The issue of religious freedom has been increasing in global significance. As you know, we are bearing witness to growing violent religious-based persecution around the world. There were those when the government announced that this office would be established who didn't really understand why. Why would you establish an Office of Religious Freedom? And I would think that the past year, as we have all witnessed, has put paid to that criticism. This religious violence touches all faith communities, and the Office of Religious Freedom speaks out on behalf of all communities facing persecution. whether they be Muslim communities, Buddhist communities, Hindu communities. However, we recognize that Christians in particular are the most persecuted faith group in the world. As reported by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank and analytical organization, and a highly respected source of data on religion, Christians have suffered persecution by the state and or by groups within society in 133 countries. That's 2/3 of the world's nation states, and suffer in more places than any other religious group. We see this persecution in numerous and diverse contexts around the world, and I'll echo some of the points that were made earlier by His Eminence Metropolitan Ambrosius. Most visible is the situation in Iraq and Syria, where we are witnessing violence and displacement on an unprecedented scale. This barbaric persecution of Christians and other religious minorities has many genocidal characteristics to it. Christian persecution also continues in China. In fact, it has increased since the government changed. This includes through the intimidation of worshippers and the destruction of churches, usually on very flimsy rationales based on violation of municipal bylaws. And in Ukraine, greater Christian unity is threatened by a Russian-orchestrated propaganda campaign seeking to instrumentalize religion and manufacture divisions within Ukrainian society. The trend for religious persecution across the board is equally startling. 74% of the world's population is now estimated to live in states with high or very high levels of government restrictions on religious activity and or social hostilities by one group against another. Shockingly, this figure is significantly higher than just 5 years ago. The growing problem that I've just given you a sense of, I believe explains why on February 19th of last year, the Government of Canada established the Office of Religious Freedom, in which I'm very humbled to serve in. The work of the office, its mandate is focused on 4 specific areas. Firstly, protecting and advocating on behalf of religious communities under threat, opposing religious hatred. Thirdly, engaging in open and frank discussion with foreign governments and foreign civil society. And finally, promoting the ability of religious communities to manifest their faith and contribute to society openly in a free and secure environment. I want to talk a little bit about the Office of Religious Freedom and concept of fundamental principles. And this comes back to those principles of truth, justice, and dignity. I want to emphasize that our mandate to advance religious freedom speaks directly to these fundamental principles of truth, dignity, and justice. And I think it's very important to recognize these as fundamental principles. Too often when we speak about rights and freedoms, we use the discourse of values. Values, however, can change with the times. They are mutable. They can be altered depending on one's perspective. Fundamental principles, by contrast, I would argue, are immutable. Truth, dignity, and justice, as fundamental principles, are not subject to the needs of the day or to the whims of society at any time. Truth, dignity, and justice point to an objective, universal truth. And I think as Christians we know what that truth is. Accordingly, we see religious freedom as connected not only to a set of Western liberal values, but as part of a more universal human experience. These principles are not simply the preserve of Western liberal democracies, but rather they are fundamental universal principles that I believe all human beings seek to benefit from and to hold up. And so we bear witness to the truth by advocating on behalf of persecuted religious groups and by speaking out both at home and abroad about the importance of religious freedom. This forms part of the advocacy function of the Office of Religious Freedom. I'll give you one specific example that was already raised earlier today. In May of this year, in coordination with many Christian leaders, such as His Eminence Metropolitan Sotirios and His Eminence Cardinal Collins, I drew attention to the plight of Mrs. Miriam Ishaq Ibrahim, a Christian woman imprisoned in Sudan, accused of apostasy. This drawing attention included an official protest to the Sudanese representative in Ottawa, a protest that was met with, at the time, indifference, but in the end, thank God, with some due attention, and she was released. In our outreach to various faith communities and in the office's work internationally, we have sought to spread the message of human dignity as central to the Canadian understanding of freedom of religion. And often when we speak about human rights, we, in our modern secular society, we tend to divorce them from the concept of dignity, especially human dignity. Human rights cannot exist without a fundamental understanding of the inherent dignity of every human being. This means that each one of us seeks to understand, from the perspective of religious freedom, who we are as human beings, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the created world in which we exist, and how we relate to God, or to a particular philosophy we might wish to pursue. All of us, as human beings, have the right to express and manifest our beliefs, and this right and this freedom must be upheld and defended. In this way, the fundamental principle of dignity is central to our policy function at the Office of Religious Freedom. At the office, we are engaged in extensive domestic and international outreach to inform and advance Canadian policy on religious freedom based on this fundamental principle of human dignity. We are also working internally within the Government of Canada to raise awareness and understanding across the Canadian Foreign Service, other ministries within the government, and to operationalize the promotion of religious freedom throughout Canada's global network of missions, embassies, high commissions. We also engage in conferences such as this one, when the opportunities present themselves, to engage key religious communities in Canada to help better inform the policy that we develop to advance religious freedom. Thirdly, our work to advance religious freedom is also linked to the fundamental principle of justice. The protection and promotion of religious freedom relates directly to the rule of law and the idea that all peoples should have the legal protections to be able to practice their faith freely and without fear. We help realize this in part through our action-based engagement. We advocate regarding particular cases of concern, such as the case of Miriam Ishaq Ibrahim, as I mentioned, and we also operate a small fund of roughly $5 million per year that allows us to support initiatives where there are significant concerns related to religious freedom and where the local government is supportive of constructive solutions. So these are projects that we undertake abroad, exclusively abroad, in the roughly 15 to 17 countries we focus on, where there's grave persecution of religion. Under the Religious Freedom Fund, we recently announced 2 projects in Ukraine. A project with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, is expected to increase awareness of international standards on religious freedom and the state's role in securing them. This will include widespread engagement with civil society, religious communities, local and regional authorities, and judicial representatives, including police forces, where we hope to work with the OSCE to train police forces to combat hate crimes and crimes that would seek to target specific religious communities. Our second project, I'm happy to say, especially with His Eminence Cardinal Collins here today, our second project is with the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, a pontifical charity established in the 1930s by Pope Pius XI, with its headquarters in New York and also a national office in Ottawa. And this project with Kanewa's partners in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Catholic University and the Religious Information Service of Ukraine, is designed to deepen interfaith awareness and understanding among the many diverse ethnic and civil communities in different regions of Ukraine, including the east and the south of Ukraine, and provide a better understanding of the challenges to freedom of religious expression. Another component of that project is to link the importance of democratic leadership with religious freedom. And this particular project will have a tremendous impact on young people from across Ukraine. We are also funding projects in a number of other regions, including in Nigeria's Plateau State. Our project here aims to develop the capacity for local religious mediation between groups, Christians and Muslims, and the creation of a dialogue between community and religious leaders. The goal is to develop a plan through which all actors involved in the intercommunal conflict between Muslims and Christian communities in the city of Jos, in the Central Plateau region of Nigeria, can basically halt persecution before it starts, such as with the recent bombings that took place there several months ago. This network of Christian and Muslim leaders was put into action, and they stopped an escalation of violence. I'd like to move on now to the subject at hand, and that is the question of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and religious freedom. And first I'd like to focus on the issue of religious freedom in Turkey. Religious freedom in Turkey is an ongoing challenge, to put it mildly. And we recognize in our office the importance of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in trying to advance religious freedom, not only in Turkey, but in the broader Near East and Middle East region. As you're all well aware, Turkey has always played an interesting bridging role between Europe and the Middle East, whether under the Byzantine period, the Ottoman rule, and most recently through the 20th century. And Turkey's history reflects some of the tensions that have come with that bridging role. We have seen the Turkish government in recent months and years take a few limited steps towards greater religious freedom. Under the leadership of former Prime Minister and now President Erdogan, the Turkish government has recognized that religious practice and religious communities can play a positive role in public life. This is in stark contrast to the Kemalist nationalism of the Turkish Republic for much of the 20th century, in which any expression of religion was pushed purely into the private sphere. The Turkish government's September 30th, 2013 so-called democratic package addressed in a very limited way some of the restrictions on religious freedom that developed during the Kemalist period of Turkey's history. We see these reforms in the Office of Religious Freedom as a very tentative first step away from the restrictive approaches of Kemalist nationalism with regard to the visibility and participation of religion in public life. We saw, for example, again in a limited way, the return of the Mor Gabriel Monastery of the Syriac Orthodox Church in the southeastern part of the country, which we certainly see as an encouraging development. However, the majority of the reforms taken under the AKP government have clearly been designed to favor the Sunni majority in the country. In order to further reform and to lift restrictions on religious freedom in Turkey, the government should embrace greater inclusivity, reflecting Turkey's religious pluralism, and uphold the freedom of religion for all religious communities in the country. There are a number of concrete steps that Turkey can take to move this forward. First and foremost, the return of religious property is a key necessity. It speaks to the need for the government to reconcile through tangible action with religious communities that were wronged during the establishment of the Turkish Republic and in subsequent decades. Of particular significance is the Theological School of Halki. The site has great historical and spiritual connections to Orthodoxy, located as it is on the site of the Monastery of the Holy Trinity founded by Patriarch Photius, almost 1,000 years before Halki's own foundation. It represents an important connection with Turkey's multi-faith past, but also a vital link, as all seminaries are, between religion, scholarship, and the vocation of seminarians and priests to contribute to the public good. In recognition of this, governments around the world, including Canada, have advocated for Halki's full and complete return to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. I raised this issue during my 2013 visit with officials from the Diyanet, Turkey's General Directorate for Religious Affairs, and Canada will continue to raise persistently this issue at all appropriate opportunities. A greater recognition of the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate within the wider Orthodox community is also an important component to advancing religious freedom in Turkey. This means appreciating the role of His All Holiness as the Ecumenical Patriarch. Recognition of other faith communities is also an important part of this effort. We have seen a continued unwillingness by the Turkish government to recognize or even engage evangelical Protestant groups and other religious minorities such as the Baha'is. During my own visit to Turkey in the fall of 2013, when I spoke with His All Holiness, he emphasized to me, and I echo this today, that members of the Greek Orthodox community, including His All Holiness, are full citizens of Turkey and must have rights equal to those of the Sunni majority. Now moving on to talk a little bit more about the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate more broadly. In particular, the unique role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in advancing religious freedom. As Ecumenical Patriarch, His All Holiness takes his rightful place as the first among equals, primus inter pares, within the wider Orthodox world. Eastern Orthodoxy, as you know, incorporates numerous manifestations of the Byzantine tradition, including the Estonian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, the Albanian Diocese of America and Canada, and the Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Church, and others. As first among equals, the role of the Ecumenical Patriarch in bringing all of these churches together under the patriarchal throne. And this role is, by its very nature, accepting and defending of diversity. The diversity that is to be found within the Eastern Orthodox churches of the Byzantine tradition. Likewise for the Ecumenical Patriarchate itself, as an ecumenical forum, it has a vocation towards dialogue and towards openness, as His All Holiness has repeatedly demonstrated, including through his dialogue with the Catholic Church and other ancient apostolic churches. And this dialogue has not only been with the Roman Catholic Church, but also with a number of the Eastern Catholic churches, notably the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. This dialogue, this openness of His All Holiness, encourages the advancement of religious freedom. Openness, tolerance, and respect for the diversity of religious expression are the fundamental keys to peace, stability, and human flourishing, and therefore towards enhancing and recognizing and defending human dignity. This means that the Ecumenical Patriarchate can play an important role in advancing the cause of religious freedom in Turkey, in the region, and in the wider world. Indeed, the Ecumenical Patriarchate has already been very active in this regard, and I'm encouraged by the ongoing actions of the Order of St. Andrew, including their efforts to organize discussions at the international level on religious freedom. I first came into direct contact with the archons at the meetings in Warsaw last year, sponsored by the OSCE, where they very openly and courageously spoke out on behalf of those Christians facing persecution throughout the Middle East. I would also welcome your perspectives, especially given my recent trip, on how this role of openness, of inclusivity, of dialogue can be advanced even further. For example, is there a role for the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Ecumenical Patriarchate in promoting religious freedom in the context of Ukraine and Russia? Just earlier this month, I spent over a week in Ukraine, visiting with the religious leaders of its churches and other faith communities. While I specifically set out to investigate religious persecution in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, I was able to hear about the important role the churches had played during the Maidan Revolution, and how they collectively, and regardless of jurisdiction, remain crucial agents of change in Ukraine's journey towards building a stronger and united democracy. In Kyiv, a city very much still wearing the scars of the Maidan, I met with leaders of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, both of the Moscow and Kievan Patriarchates. I discussed there the importance of religious freedom in developing a fertile ground for democracy with Metropolitan Antony at the Pechevska Lavra in Kyiv, and I spoke at length with His Grace Archbishop Yestrati Zoria of Chernihiv from the Kievan Patriarchate about the challenges faced by churches in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. Throughout my conversations with various laymen and clergy, I heard of how the events of the Maidan demonstrated the unity of Ukraine's various churches with Ukraine's broader national struggle for peace and good governance. This affirmed my belief that religious freedom in Ukraine is not threatened internally. It is instead threatened, as I mentioned earlier, by a Russian-orchestrated campaign that seeks to instrumentalize religion and manufacture divisions within Ukrainian society along sectarian lines. In other words, the distortion of the present geopolitical or geostrategic conflict in Ukraine into a religious conflict. It is not a religious conflict. Despite this challenge, the clergy and laymen I met underscored their crucial roles as facilitators of peace and central actors in Ukrainian society, again echoing the words of His All Holiness many times, and how they themselves, clergy and lay people, are important components in correcting the false narrative that somehow Ukrainian society has become more anti-Semitic or has become more religiously intolerant. And despite all of this, the previous Yanukovych government's intimidation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church active on the Maidan, the violence that occurred during the protests, and now the immense pressure from Russian-backed entities against various Christian groups, the churches in Ukraine remain hopeful and will be highly active in advancing human dignity, justice, and truth within a more democratic Ukraine. This means working towards a brighter future, a united Ukraine and a healthy democracy with a vibrant and cooperative community of faiths. I believe that His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, as a promoter of dialogue and inter-ecclesial and inter-religious reconciliation, could play a role here. Moving on to the situation in the Middle East. Sadly, the outlook is far less certain in other parts of the world. The spread of the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, has been accompanied by heinous acts of brutality against Iraq and Syria's religious minority communities. In August, we witnessed the scenes of tens of thousands of Yazidis stranded in the Sinjar Mountains, men, women, and children who fled en masse under threat of torture, enslavement, and death at the hands of ISIL. The gravity of the situation for Iraq's Christians is particularly severe. Hundreds of thousands have fled their homes, joining an estimated 1.8 million now dispersed by the violence in their homeland. By some estimates, the near total disappearance of Christians from the region is now unfolding. And as I mentioned before, and I'll repeat it again, with genocidal characteristics. Whereas the population included more than 1 million Christians prior to 2003, including over 600,000 in Baghdad itself, and tens of thousands more in Mosul and Kirkuk, as of late July, these numbers are estimated to have dwindled to less than 400,000, and they are dropping quickly, with many more now having fled Iraq as the violence has accelerated. The scale and impact of this loss is truly astounding. In Iraq, Christians have been present for nearly 2 millennia as members of ancient apostolic churches. And those of you who know your church history will know that after the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the small Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem fled eastwards, and they found a home in the kingdom of Edessa, King Abgar of Edessa, where they were the first to embrace Christianity outside of the apostolic heartland of the faith. The Christians have been a leaven to the people of the region, a leaven in society, and to the wider world, having made substantial economic, intellectual, and religious contributions to the common good. His All Holiness demonstrated his great pastoral concern for these Christians when I last met him in October of last year. And it's interesting, he and I had a wonderful conversation. It was scheduled for about half an hour. It went on for an hour and a half. The first 20 minutes were about Turkey, and the subsequent 45 minutes were about Christians in other parts of the world. So truly embracing his ecumenical nature. The rest of the time was a wonderful conversation on the Christian spiritual life, for which I'll always be grateful. The presence of Christian communities in Iraq and throughout the Middle East has been a stabilizing force. It has ensured religious pluralism, making possible a measure of religious toleration that is utterly necessary for the long-term viability not only of Iraqi society, but of societies throughout the region, including in Turkey. For without the presence of Christians and other religious minorities, the prospects for stability and democratic self-government are much reduced. Accordingly, we see a direct relationship between religious freedom and long-term peace and stability in the Middle East. For this reason, the Government of Canada is advancing religious freedom in Iraq as part of our overarching response to the crisis. And we have been reaching out very actively to many different churches, church organizations here in Canada to get advice on how best we can accomplish that. For this reason, this means that beyond our short-term efforts to protect religious communities that have fled the violence, we recognize that a stable Iraqi government, grounded first in religious tolerance and ultimately religious freedom, is the only reliable way out of the spiral of violence, persecution, and death being fostered by the extremist views of ISIL. This has implications that go well beyond Iraq and Syria. We already have seen over the last number of weeks in Kobani how Turkey is no longer immune to the spillover effects of this violence. The hateful ideology that motivates ISIL is also fueling violence in East Africa, in Nigeria, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and throughout the Middle East. And while the Canadian government has rightly directed the military to support our friends and allies in stopping ISIL's advance on the ground, military force alone cannot root out the long-term threat posed by Islamic extremism. The majority of Muslims in Iraq and throughout the world deplore the false interpretation of Islam in whose name the violence is being perpetrated. But they must also recognize that extremism flourishes in an environment without respect and tolerance for religious diversity and religious difference. Legal and social restrictions on religious freedom, including the prohibitions against so-called blasphemy and apostasy that we have seen elsewhere in Muslim-majority countries, cannot be allowed to take hold in Iraq or Syria. Not just because they infringe on the rights of Christians and other religious minorities to practice their faith, but because they discourage the liberalizing voices within Islam that are crucial to countering the influence of extremists in the long term. Canada is working with our friends and allies to stop ISIL in Iraq and to advance more broadly religious freedom within the world. Again, this is rooted not only in human dignity as a guiding principle, but in how that guiding principle has been articulated in international human rights covenants, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have to be able to point not only to what we understand as Christians as being the fundamental basis for justice, truth, and dignity, but also to those who would seek to have a more secular view of human rights, to point to these international human rights covenants that also articulate the fundamental importance of religious freedom. Our obligations extend well beyond the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, though. We advance religious freedom as a reflection of our multicultural and multi-faith heritage in this country, and we advocate for religious freedom on the basis not only of our values, which again can be mutable, but on the basis of the fundamental principles of truth, dignity, and justice. And just in summation, I think I want to bring it back to, again, the role that the Ecumenical Patriarchate can play, is playing in the world, to be a voice for dialogue, to be a voice for inter-ecclesial reconciliation, and His All Holiness is a tremendous witness to the importance of human dignity by his words, by his actions, and by how he represents the entire Orthodox world to the rest of the world. So I would like to, again, thank His Eminence Metropolitan Sotirios for inviting me to be part of the conference. I would also like to just take this opportunity on a personal note to thank you, Your Eminence, for your ongoing support of me personally and also the office, and I know also for your prayers, which I deeply appreciate. Ispola Despota.